Very excited to have our next guest join us to talk about education in Wisconsin. Sachin Chheda is here with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Good morning, Sachin. So nice to have you here. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Jane. So great to be here.
Let's talk about the least active legislature in possibly Wisconsin history, who just doesn't seem to want to release money that has already been approved. We're just a couple of weeks away from kids being back in class, right?
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing challenge with a legislature that, as you recall, during COVID didn't meet for 6 months and has now got these referendum questions on the ballot tomorrow to say they've got to have control. But over the last many years, we've seen that they're kind of just, unwilling to take action, unwilling to be cooperative, and it's really been a challenge. In this particular case, they agreed on a bipartisan basis with the governor and DPI to pass a new literacy law based on the science of reading. We want to really improve how we teach literacy for kids all across the state. We want to make sure the kids know how to read so they can read to learn. And then we have this $50 million. It pays for training, pays for curricular materials, pays for the coaching that teachers need. And instead of releasing that funding, there's $50 million. They've released $300,000 of the 50, so 1.5% so far. They're just sitting on the rest. And it's tied up in an arcane debate about what the limits of the governor's veto authority is. Is the governor's veto authority on partial vetoes subject to this bill or that bill? It's not something that really affects kids. At the end of the day, we all agree this $50 million should be spent, but they won't release the funding. And they've just chosen once again to be on a political battlefield, to make schools political battlefields instead of just putting kids first and figuring out how we can help serve kids.
So essentially, if I understand this correctly, the things that they are arguing about and are unhappy about have nothing to do with actually teaching our children to read. They're upset about some procedural thing.
Yeah, it's absolutely a procedural question. This type of bill, can the governor partially veto it? This kind of bill, he can't. What's the limits of his partial veto authority? Has nothing to do with whether or not we all agree that we should make these investments in improving literacy education in Wisconsin. They already passed the bill with $50 million and changing the law. The governor signed that bill. We've begun implementing the bill, but we're leaving school districts high and dry because they don't have the resources now. They need to invest in actually doing the work. Can't do things for free. Everything takes money. We want them to buy new curriculum. We want them to train their teachers. We want to make sure those teachers have the coaching that they need. And now we're not putting forward those dollars. And if they don't give, and this might, these court cases, these arcane procedural court cases take a long time. If they don't release the funding will expire. And then we'll just be even more behind the 8 ball. We're just a couple of weeks from school starting. We're trying to give school districts guidance, but what we're telling them is we can't promise them the money will ever show up because the legislature won't take this action.
That's incredibly annoying. It really is. And to me, it is yet another example, Sachin, of if things don't go their way, and I'm talking about the Republican legislature, if things don't go their way legislatively, then they go to the courts or they go to these constitutional amendments that are going to be on the ballot tomorrow. When they can't get when people don't support their policies, they just go around it.
Yeah,
we're just going to find a way to go around it.
Right. Let's just be clear here. This isn't a question about whether we support the policy. There's actually bipartisan agreement on the policy. This is purely a power exercise about who gets to make the decision at the end. Traditionally, for 150 years plus of Wisconsin history, the legislature passes a bill, puts money in the bill, governor signs the bill, and then the money gets spent by executive agencies, right? That dynamic has been shifted and changed by Speaker Voss and his allies. They just lost a massive case. They actually lost the case 6-1, and even arguably the one really just had a procedural concern. So even on the Supreme Court, right-leaning folks and left-leaning folks agreed that the legislature is overstepping their bounds. That case was on a stewardship funding case, but everybody sees that as the writing on the wall, that this idea that they function like a super legislature, that they have another kick at the can after the governor has already signed or vetoed a bill and taken action, that's just wrong. It's not really what the Constitution anticipated when we put the Constitution into place, when we became a republic, Wisconsin, the state, right? And so it's time to change that. In the short term, we can't wait for these political fights to play out. These kids need the help. These teachers need the help. These school districts need the help. And we just need to drive the ball forward. And again, there isn't any doubt. We all agree on what needs to happen, right? This isn't a question of whether we disagree about how to improve reading education. This is a question of like arcanely, what is that procedure for spending the money? And can we make it more complicated? Can we make government more bureaucratic? Or can we just go do the things that we need to do? And again, that it's very similar, as you pointed out, that to the fight tomorrow in the election about these referenda, where we cannot count on this legislature to take action, even in the face of crisis. During COVID, for 6 months, they didn't even meet, let alone take action and pass bills. And again, traditionally, the legislature doesn't meet after March or April in an election year. We understand that's a tradition. But when there's a crisis, you got to come into session and you got to do the work. And they chose not to do that. Thankfully, we had Governor Evers, who was willing to work with the federal government and spend the resources and try to mitigate the worst edges of that crisis. And we just can't let that happen again, which is why folks are fighting so hard to defeat these constitutional amendments.
If you're just joining us, Sachin Chheda is our guest. He's with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and we're talking about, at least they're consistent with doing nothing, our consistently non-productive Republican-controlled legislature sitting on more funding that our schools need in order to start a new reading curricula, which is just a couple of weeks away. So, Sachin, this looks like this just isn't going to happen. So we're gonna keep teaching the way that we have been teaching before.
So no, the law is in place. So you have to change how we teach reading. You're not allowed to use some of these old methods. You have to go to the new methods. We put the curricula out there. Basically, what it means is that school districts are on their own. They have to find the resources to do this work, to train the teachers, to coach the teachers, to make sure that they buy the curriculum materials, et cetera. They just have to do it without the additional help. It's an unfunded mandate from a Republican legislature that claims to be against unfunded mandates. But the school districts are not off the hook. They have to do things the way that we're articulating that the law says that they have to be done. The one change that they made is that the first screening is now optional this fall, but the mid-year screening and the later screening in the year are not optional. And so it's just we're just doing our best to support school districts any way that we can, but we don't have the funding released, and we're hopeful that we can convince them to even release a part of that funding so we can try to start drive these resources into local school districts.
Oh, Sachin, it's fine. Our school districts are just overflowing with extra money.
Your sarcasm is well heard. As people know, there's been over $1 billion of proposed referenda by school districts. What that tells you is that they know these are in rural districts, urban districts, suburban districts. These are in conservative-leaning districts, liberal-leaning districts. All across the state, public school districts are realizing they don't have the resources to do the things that we're asking them to do to educate kids. School funding has been flat. In the last budget, the legislature said, well, you have all this COVID money. We're not going to give you any more money. It hasn't been enough. We think that we should significantly increase the amount of special ed reimbursement, special education reimbursement that's flowing into school districts. We should invest more in mental health. We should invest more in nutrition. We should make sure that school districts have these resources around literacy education. We are fighting every day. Superintendent Jill Underly, our elected state superintendent, who I work for, is fighting every day to try to get those resources into school districts. And we're going to keep doing that. But telling that story about how they're just sitting on funding, again, I'm going to say it over and over again. They agree. The Republicans in the legislature agree. This is an important investment. They have passed this funding. The governor signed it into law, but they created a process where now the Joint Finance Committee has to release the funding that they've already passed, and they're refusing to do that. They're refusing to even have a vote on whether or not to do that because they don't want to go on the record on it. So we're hopeful that dynamic will change as the public hears more and more about this and keeps talking about it all over the state.
And that ultimately, too, is the important thing, is having the conversation with the community about these topics. And it's so hard to get it across because it's such a, as you just succinctly put it, the money's there, it's voted on, it's ready to go, let's do it. But the moment you start talking about education, they start thinking about referendum, they start thinking about teachers, they start thinking about all these things like, no. And they equate it with other points of education. And then they'll be like, maybe we don't want to give the governor a slush fund, which is what the GOP is trying to push, that notion is that the money that's been voted on is a quote unquote slush fund, which it is not. So it's great to have people like you on the show, just basically putting it out there. It's like, it's It's agreed upon. It's voted on. Let's get it out there and let's help these children.
And let's be clear, we don't have any discretion on how that money is going to be spent. The law made it very clear. Here are the things you can spend the money on. Here's how much you can spend. We don't have anything to do. Like, the superintendent is elected by the people of Wisconsin in a nonpartisan election in the spring of the year after a presidential election. She doesn't work for the governor. I don't work for the governor. So all of those political fights that are happening, that's fine. At the end of the day, we're talking about money that the Republican legislature has said should be spent on these things, and then they're not spending it. And that's kind of the most frustrating thing, is watching schools become political battlefields, whether it's this or it's book bans or all these other things that don't have anything to do with helping kids. There is a broad bipartisan agreement in the state. There has been my whole life. I mean, I grew up in Wisconsin. I went to public schools. My kids go to public schools. We all agree, Republicans, independents, Democrats alike, that we need a strong public education system. We need to compete in the global economy. We need to give kids the tools to succeed in life, whatever it is they choose to do. There isn't any disagreement about that, right? Call it Wisconsin nice, call it our tradition, right? The first state that had a kindergarten. We really believe in these things, and we believe them across the board. There's no Republican legislature going into their district and hearing from their own constituents, hey, we don't need resources for our public schools. That's not happening anywhere in the state, in any of 99 assembly districts. So that's the frustrating thing.
If you're just joining us, Sachin Chheda is our guest. He's with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Tony on the live stream had a comment. Would it be fair to say the GOP is holding up GOP-approved funding? Yes.
Absolutely. And let me just say, conservatives were the drivers, and they were right. I'm not ideological about this, right? Conservatives who had concerns about the results that we were getting in literacy across the state, what the levels of third grade reading are the drivers of the policy and the funding. They said, hey, this whole language stuff isn't working. The 3Qing isn't working. We need to refocus on kind of the traditional methods of teaching reading around, people know it kind of commonly as phonics. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But if you think about that old fight, this is driven by conservatives. These are these changes, and I agree with them. This is not about like whether I agree or disagree. I agree they were right. They actually were able to build a bipartisan majority. They were able to work with the governor. They were able to work with a progressive DPI. So absolutely, this is them stepping on their own toes. This is something they believe in. And the national, the one that people understand is they want a change in border policy. Jim Langford, the senator from Oklahoma, very conservative guy, proposed a very strong border bill, and he brought Democrats along. This is not where Democrats have traditionally been on these issues. And he brought Democrats along. He built a bipartisan majority. He got a commitment from the president that he would sign the bill. And then Donald Trump came in and said, no, we're not even going to pass our own policy. We'd rather there be a crisis than solve the problem for the American people, for kids, for families. And then we want to use it as a political cudgel. It's exactly the same thing, except in Wisconsin, we're talking about literacy education, which isn't even controversial like immigration is, right? It's like we're picking a fight over something that isn't controversial just to pick that political fight. And that has to change in our political culture. We really do believe that.
Well, I think it just reinforces again why you want to vote no on those two constitutional amendments tomorrow, because essentially this is just handing more control over dollars to the Republican-controlled legislature. And as we all know, they don't like to interrupt their vacations for anything. So if there's a crisis, don't expect that money going out the door. Sachin Chheda has been our guest with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Thank you so very much for your time.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to coming back, and I know Dr. Underley looks forward to being on soon.